Hello, my name is Joseph Greenlee, and this is the fifth video in a series in which I will be interviewing authors about their Second Amendment scholarship. I'm honored to have as a guest today Joyce Lee Malcolm. Professor Malcolm is a historian and constitutional scholar who focuses on the development of individual rights in Great Britain and America. She's the author of 8 books and numerous scholarly articles and has been cited in roughly 70 U.S. court cases, including by the U.S. Supreme Court in the landmark Second Amendment case, District of Columbia versus Heller. Today, we'll be discussing her extremely influential book, To Keep and Bear Arms, The Origins of an Anglo-American Right, which focuses on the English right to arms and how it influenced the American right to arms. The book looks like this, and we'll post a link to it in the description below. And then I wanted to take this opportunity to thank my very good friend Adam Kraut. Actually sent me this beautiful edition several years ago, and it's happens to be authored by Professor Malcolm on the inside cover. So thank you very much to Adam, and thank you, Professor Malcolm, for joining us today.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
To start, I should probably ask why, as Americans in 2025, with nearly 250 years of our own rich history, tradition, customs, and laws, why we should be concerned about what happened in England nearly 4 centuries ago.
I think it's really important, and I should say that before I did that book focusing on the English right, a lot of people thought that the right to be armed in America just came because they were going to a wilderness, and so it didn't make any link between the English right. But the English for centuries have been very proud of being what they called freeborn Englishmen. We were listening online to the proms, it's sort of a patriotic fest, music fest at the end of August, and the English are saying, British never, never will be slaves. I mean, this was so important. And all of the charters that we got from England for our colonies said that the colonists would have the same rights as if they were born and abiding in England. And this was important because it took something to get them to go across the ocean into this unpopulated, or certainly by their likes, land. So they had the same rights as Englishmen, and it meant a great deal to them. And it's important for us to understand how it developed. My dissertation actually, and this book is mostly on how it moved from being something that people had as a duty into being what was a right. And we inherited that right, although looking at the background of the English right, you can see how our Second Amendment is much more vigorous and protective. And then the second point that I just wanted to make about why we should study it is that Great Britain no longer has the right. It barely has the right to self-defense. That's really questionable. They think if you're defending yourself, that's being a vigilante, making yourself judge and jury in your own case. And so I think it's an important lesson for us, coming from a country where until the 20th century, there was a really strong right to be armed, to one that now has virtually none. And I think that that's a kind of cautionary tale on how easy it is to lose that right.
So in the opening sentence of the book, you state that the right of citizens to be armed not only is unusual, but evolved in England in an unusual manner, began as a duty. What duty did Englishmen traditionally have to be armed?
I should say, when I said that it's unusual, most rulers are not happy with their people being armed. And obviously there wasn't a police force until the 19th century in England. So people had, first of all, a right to defend themselves and a duty. You're created in God's image. You have a right to protect yourself, but you also were supposed to protect your neighbors, protect your village. People took turns standing watch at night and ward during the day. They were to chase culprits. If the sheriff started a hue and cry, you were obliged to go running with him to catch these people. And in fact, if someone in your area had stolen some money from someone, the people in that area had to reimburse the person who was the victim. So there was a real interest in trying to catch these people. And then finally, rather than a professional army, they had a militia. And you had a militia duty, all the able-bodied men at first from 16 to 60. And according to your wealth, there were certain particular weapons that were prescribed for you to own. So there was all of this obligation to help keep the peace of the realm. And that was a duty. It was not a right. It wasn't until the late 17th century that it became a right.
And we saw a lot of those same duties in America in the early, around the same time in the 17th century and certainly into the 8th. So this interview, like the book, will focus on the period from the English Civil War, which began in 1642 through the adoption of the English Bill of Rights, which was adopted in 1689. But to bring us up to that period, and I know I'm asking you to cover a lot of ground, so maybe just a summary. Yes. Could you please explain what gun ownership looked like in the maybe 17th, I guess 16th century England and leading into the first half of the 17th century?
Yes, so I'll give you a capsule account. Englishmen had been very successful using bows and arrows. They had the longbow. And so it was a long time before they made really serious use of firearms. In the 16th century, under Henry VIII, everyone was obliged to give each of their sons at age 7 a bow and arrows. Henry was very reluctant to use firearms, and one of the reasons was they were so awkward. They were dangerous to use, they were heavy to use. There was a law against using what they called hail shot, which is shot, which kind of sprayed in all directions. These big, heavy muskets could blow up. They were actually, the people who made them were originally were bell founders. So they had to be very carefully used. And there were, as they became more popular, there were certain restrictions by income. So if you had something like 100 pounds in value of land, you could use what they called a handgun. But people under that could not use a handgun. And I should say a handgun had a barrel that was about 2 feet long, or a crossbow bent, because those smaller weapons could be hid under a cloak and might be used by highway robbers. But if you read the law, it says that even though people who have less income are not supposed to be carrying these around, they still had to own them and be drilled in their use. So the towns were required to have these targets at the edge of the town, which they were to practice at during holidays. And so the people, as they transitioned from simpler weapons into firearms, and the firearms became somewhat less awkward to use and less dangerous, people were still required to have them and be able to use them. It was not a right, but it was definitely a duty.
So the English Civil War started in large part over a dispute between King Charles I and Parliament over who controlled the militia and the controversial standing army that Charles had built. Can you explain how that dispute came about?
Yeah, I should say that the English were really wedded to the idea of the militia, because there was this sense that the militia was made up of your neighbors and they would never harm you. Whereas professional armies were looked upon as dangerous, and kings could use those to suppress their people, which was happening in Europe and we still see today. I mean, there are a lot of places that don't look like they're under threat have armies, and the armies are really there to keep the people in check. And there was this sort of a more and more sense of your right to be armed. There were no laws against it into the middle of the 17th century. And then there was a lot of worry because King Charles II, Charles I, had married a Catholic princess from France. And since the Protestant Reformation in the middle of the 16th century, there had been worries about Catholics because the Pope had called upon Catholic Englishmen to overthrow the Protestant monarchy. So if you were a good Catholic, you were supposed to be obeying the Pope. If you were a good Englishman, you were not supposed to do that. You would be a traitor. So there were always worries about Catholics, not that they couldn't have arms to protect themselves, but that if they were seen to be amassing arms, that would be a danger. So the militia was always preferred to a standing army. And what happened in the middle of the 17th century was that there's a big mix of religious issues and constitutional issues here. And the English Reformation produced the Church of England, which was under the king, under the crown, still is a defender of the faith. The Scots had their own Reformation, and it produced the Presbyterian Church, which was not a part of the Church of England, didn't want to be a part. And Charles had sent prayer books from the Church of England up to Scotland and had them read there. And the Scots went mad. The poor guy reading the Church of England handbook had stools and everything thrown at him. And then they declared that they were not going to be put under the jurisdiction of this Protestant church. It was called the Bishops' War, and they formed an army and came down into England. And Charles was obliged to get together an army to go and fight against these people. And he had no army really but the militia. And most of the militia members kind of sympathized with the Scots. They worried that Charles was too Catholic. His wife had priests and they went to mass. So he had to make a deal basically with the Scots. He basically paid them for a ceasefire. But the only way he could raise that money was by calling a parliament. So he called a parliament, but he hadn't called one in many years because he was trying desperately to raise money without calling a parliament. That was one of the great rights of Englishmen, that you couldn't have a general tax without Parliament approving it. So he called this Parliament, which became known as the Long Parliament, and they had a list of grievances from years since there hadn't been a Parliament, and a lot of them had to do with the militia, and they were worried about his having a professional army at all. And while they were struggling with all these, the Irish Catholics, Charles was in a bad situation. He has different religions in each of his three realms. So there were mostly Catholics in Ireland, except for a few Protestants. They rebelled in 1641. And Charles wanted to form an army to go across and suppress the rebellion. The militia never was obliged to join one of these professional armies. Anyway, the Parliament was really worried about his having an army for fear that he would use it against them and his opponents in England. And so that was the controversy. Will we give him money to form an army? Will we be in charge of the militia and not have him, who traditionally was in charge of the militia, like our president in charge of the armed forces? And finally, Parliament just got disgusted and they passed their own Militia Act, which gave them power over the militia. All of this was worry about the power of the sword and who could wield it. And that act passed over the king's opposition, and he called all his loyal subjects to him. And basically a war broke out between the Parliament and the king. Parliament was fighting for the rights of Englishmen. They were fighting for the Protestant faith. The king had a motto called "Give Caesar his due," which was very, I think, not a wise motto. But at any rate, the king founded a field army because he didn't trust the militia, whereas Parliament relied on the militia. So you have these two different sources of power and uses of the sword. And the war went on for several years until 1646. The Parliament ended up with the Scots as allies, and the king had the Catholic Irish as allies. So there was both religion and rights. And in 1646, there was the Battle of Naseby, which ended with the victory of Parliament over the crown. And Charles was put in prison, and then they didn't know what to do with him because he was still king. They tried to get him to sign all kinds of promises that he would behave himself. But I have actually read some of the manuscripts where I have a list of what he was subscribing to, but in the margins he was saying, but of course, once I'm back in power, I won't pay any attention. It's the kind of controlling executive is never easy. And in this case, especially one that had such differences with the people, it was hard. Anyway, during the time when they were trying to negotiate with him, he was busy plotting to break out. There was what they called a second civil war in 1648. He broke away. He fled to an island, which was not smart. They called back their army. I should say Parliament ended up with a field army called the New Model Army because the militia didn't want to serve for long periods of time. Anyway, the king got captured and brought back, and they realized they couldn't deal with him, so they put him on trial. He was put on trial for treason against his people. And they went through this kind of standard trial, although it was quite unusual because the rule was that the king could not be tried because he had no peers. But they just ignored that, and there were a group of parliamentarians who agreed to try him and a lot who backed off and went home. And of course, if you try the king, you better find him guilty. And he was found guilty. And in 1649, he was executed. And there was a real horror at that. No one knew what was going to happen. And what was left was what they called the rump parliament, the people who had agreed to try him and still sit there. And eventually, Oliver Cromwell became, who was one of the generals in charge of this army, became as he called it, Lord Protector. He just threw the Parliament out. There were differences. They didn't want to pay the New Model Army, and so he tossed them out, and he took over. And England, the English people, which had resented professional soldiers and really wanted a militia, ended up being ruled by this parliamentarian army. I mean, they were treated fairly, but in the way of revolution, sometimes you don't get what you started out wanting to have. So the country was divided into these districts. Each was ruled by a major general of an army. And then in 1658, Cromwell died, and his son, who was not very strong character, was unable to govern, and the place was chaos with all these different armies. And George Monk, who was the major general of the army that was then in Scotland, decided to bring his army down into England and call a parliament and restore the monarchy. Charles I's son had been living in Europe, Charles II, with his brother, and had been there for some years, kind of living hand to mouth. And there was more and more a consensus of feeling, well, maybe the bad old days weren't as bad. And people wanted to get back to some sense of normality. It was a revolution that had gone full cycle. And none of the other armies and generals opposed Monk. He came back into London. He called what was called a convention parliament, because only the king could call it an official parliament. And they met, and they decided that they had to take some precautions in recalling the king from exile. And although there was such, how to put it, such anxiety to get him back, that they didn't want to take the usual precautions. And so they didn't even reconfirm Magna Carta. They just let him come back in. And when he came back, he was greeted by the New Model Army, who escorted him through the streets of London. And he looked around at all these people who were weeping and joyful he was back. And he said, if I realized I'd been so missed, I would have come back earlier. So he comes back, but they haven't taken precautions to make sure that he doesn't duplicate some of the restrictions on their rights that his father had. And so they end up having to go through a revolution all over.
So when Charles came back, Charles II in 1660, what views did he take on, what were his priorities when it came to the right of Englishmen to be armed, or I guess at that point, maybe still ability or duty, but how did he feel about the population being armed? And did he take any action to, I guess, disarm his political opponents and accuse them of being dangerous?
Oh yeah, he was really worried. I mean, he was being escorted by the New Model Army that had been there to execute his father, and they were all armed. And so there were all these efforts to try to disarm them politely so they wouldn't get upset, send them home. He had an army. There were 2 regiments of the Coldstream Guards who were still on duty, and he preserved them. There had been this attempt by a group of sort of religious zealots to overthrow him, and he used that as an excuse to keep those 2 regiments and build an army. And there were efforts to disarm those who had been disloyal and take their weapons away. So first, he was very careful, but gradually he got, more of an army and was able to take measures against it. There were some resentments and riots, and he was really afraid that he would be overthrown and have to, as he would go on his travels again. So he retrieved the charters that different towns had and reduced the number of people who could actually vote, so he had more control over them. They were able, through the Militia Act, to kind of weed out the people in the militia who he felt were not reliable and not loyal. People had to take an oath of allegiance to him, which had been typical before. But now there was this feeling that, obviously, if you're taking an oath to the king and you don't want to take it, they can immediately see that you're not loyal. So there was a lot of effort to get rid of the weapons that belonged to those who were opponents. And then finally, late on in his realm, there were a couple of plots. One was called the Popish plot, and that was there was all this worry that the Catholics who were in Ireland were going to take the short sail across the English Channel and invade England and kill all of the Protestants in their beds. And so there was this real panic, which enabled them to try to reduce the number of weapons that the Catholics in England had so that they wouldn't rise up. And although it's unclear how thorough they were, because there was still this feeling that however disloyal you might be, you ought to be able to protect yourself. And then finally, there was something called the Rye House plot. And that was a plot, and I think historians are never too clear about it, that there was a plot to assassinate Charles II and his brother James II in their coach as they went past the Rye House on their way to Newmarket for the horse races. And what this was found out and prevented, and it was unclear who was really behind it, but the Crown used it as an excuse to execute the leaders of the opposition in Parliament, people who worried about protecting the religion and preserving their rights. And anybody who seemed to have been affiliated with these people was also disarmed. So they started to disarm a lot of the people who were the traditional county nobles and gentry who had been justices of the peace, basically the establishment of the time. And I note, I read letters of somebody who was a justice of the peace who had been disarmed, and he was furious and upset because he said, having been a judge, he's afraid to go out. If he's unarmed, he feels defenseless. But they basically alienated a lot of the people in the towns, a lot of the establishment who were suspicious of the aims of the king. And one thing that I should also add is that one of the ways that Parliament kept kings from having a big army was that they had to finance it. And Parliament would never give them enough money to finance a big army. But what happened was that Louis XIV in France had a lot of money. And he secretly was giving money to Charles and then later his brother James, so that they had money without the Parliament. And so they were able to have a bigger and bigger professional army and not rely so much on the militia.
And that money was that in exchange for a promise from Charles II to convert the England to Catholicism?
Yes, yes. It was all very secret. It was all very secret, but he had promised, he said when the time was right, that he would convert England, the English Protestants, to Catholicism again. And actually, Charles may have been or have converted to Catholicism because on his deathbed, he called for a priest and not a Protestant minister. So this was all very secret. And I don't know that I don't know how well that came out, but eventually they found out that he had made this promise and everybody was really furious. So these two issues of the religious rights and your civil rights as a citizen were sort of intermingled in all of these efforts during those years.
And then another significant event that happened during Charles II's reign was the Game Act. The Game Act of 1671 had, as I understand it, pretty significant impact on the right of ordinary Englishmen to be armed. Could you please describe that?
Yeah, there was a long history of game acts that preserved game for the owners of estates and the wealthier people, partly because they liked the idea of hunting, and people would give gifts of game to friends, but also because they did not like the idea of ordinary people being out there shooting in the woods. It was very easy to have an accident, unfortunately. So the Game Acts had prohibited people from having gun dogs and nets and other things for hunting, unless you were one of the privileged. But in 1671, for the first time, they passed an act that actually outlawed people having guns. And to me, it made no sense because the militia has to have weapons. But at any rate, they outlawed, along with the dogs and everything else, the people having firearms. The only thing about it was that it was to be enforced not by the sheriffs, but by the gamekeepers on these individual estates. And so it was unclear how rigorous they were in enforcing it. And looking through all of the records, I found that the only times that I could find that it was enforced is if you had actually violated not only the gun law, but used your gun on a Sunday to kill somebody else's doves in their dovecot. You had to have committed several crimes before they actually bore down and tried you for it. And even then, you were only maybe deprived of your gun for several years, and you could have it back afterwards.
So it wasn't enforced as strictly as the language of the actual act.
No, it wasn't. Although, looking at it, it was something that actually Charles's brother would use to try to disarm people. But it hadn't been something that the crown used. It was on the local level.
So only 2 years, you had mentioned the Rye House plot of 1683, and only 2 years after that happened, Charles II passed away in 1685. His brother, who would become King James II, succeeded him. And then upon becoming king, James promised that he would not abuse his power and would preserve the nation and all its lawful rights and liberties. but most Englishmen remained fearful of both Catholicism and standing armies. And King James II was both Catholic and had inherited a significant peacetime army from his brother. How did that all play out?
Yeah, there were a couple of riots against a Catholic taking over, and when they were defeated, James was able to use that as an excuse to have an even bigger army. So he relied on this large army. He was voted a lot of money by Parliament to enlarge the army and to keep it. And he also used these threats to start disarming Protestants. First in Ireland, where only Protestants were supposed to be in the Irish army, and they disarmed the Protestants on the excuse that they were too short, and gave the guns to even shorter Irishmen. So there was a lot of worry in England. And then he started in England going after people who he didn't trust. And then there are a couple of things. He tried to get people to pass a Toleration Act, which we could probably sympathize with, that they would tolerate Catholics among them, tolerate the Protestant dissenters like the Presbyterians. But the Englishmen did not want to do that. They had their religion and they were sticking with it. And they were really worried that that act would be used to make Catholicism the official religion. And then he called a parliament, and people who were to sit for parliament had to take an oath that they would vote for this Toleration Act, that they would live neighborly with their Catholic neighbors. So what happened was lots of ordinary Englishmen who would have sat for Parliament refused to do it. And so James kept changing people. He got rid of a lot of the members of town councils who were reluctant to agree to this, and put in people who were willing to vote for this Toleration Act. And so eventually he gets a parliament that's basically kind of stuffed with the people that he favors. And then the Toleration Act became a real cause of a problem, because they wanted it read from the pulpit on 3 successive Sundays. And the bishops of England refused to do that, saying this was against their oath, their religious oath. So they actually put these bishops in the Tower and put them on trial, which was a bad mistake. And the jury found them innocent, and much to the relief of everybody. But it was, a bad blow for James. And then the other thing that was kind of the final issue was that James was older. He'd been married for several years, and there had been no children. And suddenly this Catholic wife has a baby, and it's a boy. So they felt they could outlive James. He'll go, and then when he first went abroad, he was a Protestant, and he had 2 Protestant daughters, Mary and Anne. And they thought, well, one of them will become queen and we'll be safe. But now that there's a son who's Catholic, he would take precedence over these 2 Protestant daughters. And James made the terrible error of choosing as the godfather of his baby the Pope. I mean, he wasn't too shrewd when it came to diplomacy and things like that. And so that was the last straw. That now they were going to have Catholicism would be solidified in the realm. And so some of the nobles called upon William of Orange, who was married to James's older Protestant daughter, Mary, to come in and save the faith of the Englishmen, save their religion and save their rights. And then James went out with this army to combat these people who came with William. And the army did what it was called melting away. Nobody wanted to do it. Nobody wanted to fight for James, even though they're getting paid by him. And so William and Mary were able to come into the country to great acclaim. it was called the Glorious Revolution because there wasn't a shot having to be fired. James's army just disappeared. He fled the country, throwing the Great Seal of State in the Thames as he went by, assuming that there could be no more statutes sealed with it. And William and Mary came, called a parliament, at first the convention parliament, because they weren't yet king and queen. And the parliament decided that they would not make the same mistake that they had made when Charles I came in. They would make sure that the king and queen had to ratify a statute that had a Bill of Rights in it. And that statute would crown them king and queen. At the same time, they would have promised to obey this list of rights. And it was 100 years before our Bill of Rights. I think we were kind of using that paradigm and technique. So, I mean, the people say, well, it could have been better written, but they had to please William. And also a lot of the rights that they asserted were ancient and indubitable were not ancient and indubitable. They were just rights that they wanted and they wanted confirmed. And one of those was the right of the people to have arms.
Yeah, and what did the Declaration of Rights of 1689 Bill of Rights end up saying about the right to arms?
Well, there were two things. First, that the subjects, which are Protestant, which would have been something like 90% of the population, may have arms for their defense, suitable to their condition, and as allowed by law. So there are these clauses in there. Suitable to their condition means, you know, wealthy people could have a lot of guns. If you're a poor guy, not so many. But you were entitled to have arms suitable to your condition. As allowed by law meant that left the way open for Parliament to restrict that. So it was always whatever Parliament decided was put into that right. And then the second thing was that they said that there could be no standing army during a time of peace without the consent of Parliament. And they claimed this was an ancient right, but it was not. So basically their fear of an army and their insistence that the ordinary people be armed were both kind of reflected in that Bill of Rights.
So William Blackstone wrote extremely influential commentaries on the laws of England. I think the first volume of the first edition came out in 1765.
Yeah, so you're very good with yours.
Well, it's cited very often, and especially in constitutional law in America, and especially about, well, the Supreme Court called it the preeminent authority on English law for the founding generation. Did Blackstone have anything to say about the English right to arms?
Yes, he was. It's interesting because it was just before the American Revolution, 1765 to 69, that these volumes came out. Yes, he did. He said that the rights that Englishmen there was a right to be armed for self-preservation and defense. So self-preservation meant an individual right and defense. And then he listed, after all of the rights that he puts in the book, what he called 5 auxiliary rights. And these included trial by jury and the right to petition for grievances. But the last auxiliary right was the right to be armed for self-defense. And he said that right was to protect all the other rights in case they were taken away or threatened. So it was basically made them not a attachment barrier, but a really important way for the people to maintain their liberties.
So going back to the U.S. Supreme Court, it has stated that the Second Amendment was not intended to lay down a novel principle, but rather codified a right inherited from our English ancestors. How did the history that we've covered up to this point today, what does it tell us about the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution? And I guess, does it tell us anything about our right to keep and bear arms today?
Yes, it was really important that, in other words, it wasn't novel. It was, there were people, as there still are, who feel there should be no right to be armed. They don't trust their fellow citizens. but it was a right that a pre-existing right. So it doesn't say in the Second Amendment, there shall be a right to be armed. It just says the right to be armed shall not be infringed. So it basically accepts this right. What it does, however, is it makes the language is much stronger. It simply says the right of the people to keep and bear arms. Oh, I should start with saying a well-regulated militia. That was how they got the militia. Necessary to the security of a free state. That's your anti-army phrase. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. There's nothing about religion in there. There's nothing about your status. There's nothing about the Congress being able to infringe it. It shall not be infringed. So it was very much stronger than the English right.
So in the afterword of the book, you state that the right to be armed, and you said it at the beginning of this interview, it's really no longer a right of Englishmen today. You also provide a quote in there from Jean-Louis Delhomme, who famously published a book in 1771 entitled The Constitution of England. And in the book, he praises the rights of Englishmen, but recognizes that many are, quote, but feeble defenses against the real strength of those who govern, and that it is the right to arms that really kept their rulers in check. Delhomme further wrote that the power of the people is not when they strike, but when they keep in awe. It is when they can overthrow everything that they never need to move. Do you think that England has suffered as a result of losing the right to be armed and thus their ability to keep their rulers in awe?
First of all, I think that he was right, that people say, well, why do people need to be armed? What would their personal arms do against an army or a dictator? But dictators usually start by disarming people. So it does make a difference. And I'm forgetting the second part of your, do I think that it makes a difference?
Yeah, do you think they've suffered just the English today of not being able to keep their rulers in awe?
Well, they certainly have suffered in not being able to protect themselves. They had a pretty vigorous right to be armed right up through World War One. And it was only after World War One when I think the Parliament, leaders of Parliament, the government was worried about a Bolshevik revolution because the Russian Revolution had just taken place, and there were worries that that the unions and others in England would have a revolution. They were worried about men coming back from what was a horrible war, and who no longer had the usual constraints about behaving themselves in society. So they really wanted some kind of control, and they passed this Pistols Act, this Gun Act in 1920, and it said that it was up to the local police to decide whether someone was a fit person to have a gun and had a reason to have it. And a lot of American gun control laws basically have the same kind of attitude. Are you the right person? Your police have to verify that. Do you have a reason to have it? And basically they use that to disarm even officers coming back from World War One. They could say that they weren't fit or that they had no reason. You're living in the countryside. And over the years, I should say the police in England are run by the Home Office. So they're national control over them. And the Home Office had a series of classified documents tightening up that restriction on a good reason. So that by, I think it was 1969, there was no longer a good reason to have a gun for self-defense. And even banks could not have someone armed to protect the valuables in that bank. But ordinary people did not know. This was never debated in Parliament. It was just classified, tightening up the screws on who could be armed. And what you have today is that, and I should say, there was in 1986, there was a massacre in Scotland with a lot of children being killed by Billy, a deranged man. And so they had a big campaign to take the handguns out of the hands of ordinary citizens, on the idea, I guess, that somehow this would make a difference. And that when the Parliament passed this, basically, it wasn't a proper buyback. They just really wanted to confiscate all the weapons. When they passed that, there were two amendments that they rejected. One was that the Olympic target shooting team in England could not practice in England. They could not have guns in England. They had to go to the continent to practice. And the second one was to allow handicapped shooters to be able to have a gun, because it was one of those sports that they could compete in. So that was also rejected. There was no way that individuals were supposed to be able to have a firearm, and they confiscated all these weapons. And then within 10 years, the number of gun crimes with illegal weapons had doubled. In other words, it didn't matter. They took all these guns away from people who were probably never going to misuse them. You can have a rifle, but you have to keep it in a safe that's bolted to the floor, and you must belong to a gun club in order to have it. You cannot carry anything that you will use to protect yourself. If you carry chemical spray, you can get 10 years in prison for chemical spray, or a knife that's more than, I guess, 3 inches long. So they just keep adding more and more things with the idea that you don't need them because society will protect you. So the Parliament agreed to these laws, and there were very serious worries about what it would mean for the ordinary individual if there was someone breaking into their house. But they passed them anyway, and they're now sort of living with the repercussions. And if you have a minute, I would just say I wrote a second book called Guns and Violence, The English Experience, and it goes through how they had the right and then how they lost it. But they now cannot, as I say, protect themselves. You're not supposed to do anything that will harm someone who breaks into your house. Otherwise, you can be cited for harming somebody. There was a man who had 2 burglars break into his house, and he held them with a toy gun, sort of realistic looking, while he called the police. And when the police came, they arrested the 2 guys, but they also arrested him for putting someone in fear with a toy gun. So it's as an American, I find it pathetic. I mean, one of the things Blackstone had said was about self-defense, that it was something that no government could take away. And I think that the English governments have taken away this right with the notion that somehow society will defend you. And one other point, the police in England have a website where people can send in questions. And one of the questions came from a woman who said, how can I protect myself on the street when I go shopping? And the answer was, well, you can't carry anything, but except maybe a rape whistle. You can blow this whistle. And you're not supposed to yell help. You're supposed to yell call the police, because people are supposed to walk on by and let the professionals handle it. And the other thing is that they had some kind of a dye that you could squirt at the person who was attacking you, but you must be careful not to get it in their eyes. So they always assume Parliament would never take away their rights. And basically Parliament is now sapping their right to freedom of speech. But they first did this right for self-defense. And I pray that they get that back, but it's become ridiculous that there are more and more items that get put on this prohibited list, lest you use it to protect yourself.
Yeah, that all reminds me of two things. First, I believe I remember reading that during World War II, after the English had been largely disarmed, they had a severe arms shortage, and then the British government actually appealed to American citizens, just ordinary citizens, said, please send us any extra guns you have.
Yes.
And then so Americans sent them over, and they used them, and then but afterwards they didn't take the lesson that, maybe it's a good thing for some people to have guns here in case something like this happens. And they also didn't return them to the Americans. I believe they put them on a ship and just dumped them into the ocean.
Oh dear.
All the guns the Americans had sent over. And then secondly, it just reminded me of sometimes you'll see English like police departments posting on social media, they'll bragging about the weapons they've confiscated off the streets, the dangerous weapons, and there will be, you know, butter knives and screwdrivers in there. And
Oh, I don't, pathetic.
yeah, it really shows you how helpless they're rendering their people there.
They are. And I remember being on a BBC program some years ago when they were talking about arming the police, which they needed to do because there was a massacre when a man went around his town for 6 hours shooting people, and the police could not stop him. They had to call in police from somewhere else. But at any rate, they had an officer on talking about whether he wanted to be armed or not. And much to my surprise, he said, no, he didn't, because all of the rules and regulations and requirements would be so difficult. You know, he didn't want to have that constraint on him of being armed, where if he misused his gun in some way, he'd be punished.
So my final question about the book, and this is really for my own edification, so I hope the audience and you will bear with me, but I'd like to return to the very beginning, the book's dedication page. It reads, "For my father, Jacob Newworth Citron, who loves learning." And this has actually stuck with me since I first read it about a decade ago. Every time I read the dedication of any book I read, I think of this one, and only this one. And so it's really kind of stuck in my mind. And it's a beautiful tribute in the sense, I think part of the reason it stuck with me, it's a beautiful tribute in the sense that it really says a lot about your father in, you know, 3 words, which is hard to do. And also, I think it stuck with me because he clearly instilled his love of learning in you, which has been very apparent today in this interview. And as a father myself, I wonder how he did that, because teaching somebody to enjoy learning, from my experience, is a very difficult thing to teach someone. So it's a strange question, and this is why I left it for the end. But do you have any advice, perhaps something maybe you learned as being a professor all these years, or from your father, that any advice for teaching someone how to love learning?
Yes, he was an example. I think that was what it was. He was an example. He had started college, and then the Depression broke out, and he had to come home and go to work. So he never got to really finish. Yet he took courses afterwards. He loved mathematics, not history, mathematics. And he had a desk, but he never used it. He had a bridge table set up in the middle of the living room with all these perfectly sharpened pencils. And there he would sit and do these mathematical problems for his great joy. And even later in life, you know, if you saw him or talked to him, he would say, well, if you see a great biography about this person or that person, buy that book for me and let me know, you know, send it. So he just always enjoyed learning things. And as I say, he was really an example of someone who did it for the pleasure of it. And I think that was how I felt about him. I've actually started a scholarship in his honor at the little town I grew up in, in math for graduates of the high school.
That's beautiful. I didn't realize that. Well, thank you. So I guess my very, very final question is, where can people find your work if they want? You mentioned this other book. Of course, you have several others beyond that. Where can people find that?
Where, as they say on it, wherever books are sold. Amazon has that. It's called Guns and Violence, the English Experience. And it goes through the history of guns in England, and then, you know, the decline in the 20th century.
Great. Well, if this wasn't too painful, then maybe we can have you back to talk about that one at a later date.
Hey, well, thank you for this invitation. I really appreciate it.